Hello, viewers. Welcome back. As always, I'm Sarah Hurley, and with me,
I'm Midday Pugh, and we are so excited to have you guys back here. But before we get into the episode, we kind of want to talk about where we are because neither of us are in our normal home location. Sarah, where are you at?
I am currently in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. As you might have noticed from the last episode, I have indeed changed locations. I've been here at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, completing an undergraduate fellowship program with a bunch of really cool young scholars from across the country, which has been a really wonderful opportunity for me. So I'm here in my silly little dorm room. What about you, Dea? Where are you?
I am currently studying abroad in England. Right now, I'm in London. I'm in actually the UNC Winston House, which is our kind of London home base. But I'm studying abroad in England for 6 weeks, London for the first two. I'll be leaving here soon, actually, and heading up to the Lake District. And then after that, I'll spend 2 weeks in Oxford. So I'm very excited to be where I am. It's a very big trip for me, but it's been fun to read Jane Eyre in in English setting because the novel takes place in England and is written by an English author. So it's cool to read it here.
Will you be visiting the Bronte Parsonage Museum on your way to the Lake District?
I will be doing my best. It is a little bit out of the way, and I do have class actually since I'm studying abroad. But if I am able to spare the time in my schedule, then I would absolutely love to.
Well, I'm sure we would love to hear all about it if you are able to stop by. Um, as many of you may also have noticed, we did have to push back the dates just for this week's chapters for Jane Eyre because it was really my fault, guys. I got poison ivy. It was not fun. It's kind of cleared up by now. I had to take some steroids and antibiotics. Um, but I am feeling much recovered now, so we will be continuing with the chapters going forward as scheduled. The only alteration that we had to make to the schedule was this week, so instead of breaking up the last two chunks of the novel into chapters 18 through 23 and 24 through 27. We're just going to do 18 through 27, and that's an absurdly large number of chapters, but it's okay. I have faith we can pull through. Then going forward, of course, on July 8th, we'll do chapters 28 through 33. On July 15th, chapter 34 through the end of the novel. And then on July 22nd, we will have a very special episode covering adaptations, all that fun stuff, maybe modern afterlives, adaptations, and final thoughts on the novel, the story, Charlotte Bronte. And we may even have a special guest star for that episode, so you'll have to stay tuned.
And last but not least, before we jump into the novel, please, 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 pretty please donate. We really, really appreciate your donations at Jane Austen Summer Program and Jane Austen and Co. as well, because we are in collaboration with J and Co. Your donations are very much appreciated because this is a nonprofit, or these are nonprofit organizations. And Sarah and I are doing this blog as a volunteer project. So we would really appreciate your donations because they help us fund the technology that we use to create these episodes, and they help us run the website and allow us to update the blog, all those sorts of things. So please, please, please consider donating.
Thank you. All right, Miss Nadea, would we like to get into a brief summary of chapters 18 through 27 of the magnificent novel Jane Eyre?
Keyword being brief, hopefully.
Trying to speed
Yeah,
run
so
through.
yes, have a little speed run through. Hopefully no digression, or not as many digressions at least. It's been a little bit since I read chapter 18, so I'm gonna flip back in my book a bit and try and recap and make sure I don't miss any important things. Um, I know Blanche Ingram was important. I do not exactly remember why, but I'm looking to find out. Feel free to give me a little hint if you'd like while I flip through my
So
pages.
Blanche Ingram was the woman that Mr. Rochester was kind of courting. We find out later that he's only kind of doing it for fakesies to make Jane jealous because he's a weirdo. He likes to play the mind games. But Blanche Ingram is this young, wealthy, beautiful socialite who's pretty shallow. She and her mother are pretty cruel to Jane.
Mhm.
Um, and she's basically only after Mr. Rochester for his money. She's very clear about that. And so they've got this little courtship flirtation thing going on. I'm not sure it's ever like consider I'm not sure a formal offer of marriage is ever made or anything, but it's very much implied that they're headed down that road for a
They
while.
are they are very much intended to be seen as betrothed, but it's all a part of Mr. Rochester's kind of evil, manipulative plan. Um, yeah, I we have to talk about this fortune teller thing now.
Yeah, the fortune teller thing. What did you think about the fortune teller thing?
I thought it was really, really fun. And then when we found out that it was actually Mr. Rochester disguised as the fortune teller, I thought it was less fun. I thought that was kind of creepy of him to do. I
Yeah, he's
didn't totally understand why. Yeah, very what he's such a freak, but he disguises himself as a fortune teller and comes to Thornfield, and is telling everybody's fortunes, and but like in secret, so not in a public space. He calls them privately into a room and then tells them their fortunes and then sends them back out. And he does so with Miss Ingram, and she does not hear something um, to her advantage, as Jane calls it. So,
yes. What
or
is
doesn't appear to at least.
what is it that he tells her?
Do we know for sure?
Yes, we do.
We do.
He leads her to
Oh,
believe that Mr. Rochester's fortune is not as large as she thought it was,
mm, okay.
which kind of
Makes
ru-
her a little less interesting.
ruins any sort of affection she might have harbored
Mhm,
for him because she is indeed a gold digger, which, in
mhm.
my is the only reason you would go after Mr. Rochester. However,
Oh yeah. He also reads Jane's fortune, um, or attempts to at least. But as he is telling her fortune, she kind of figures out his ruse and is like, "Why are you doing this? This is so weird." Um, I can't remember his response to that, but I know that she figures it out, and he's very impressed that she figures it out. Um, and he admires her brain and her smarts and all that good stuff.
mm-hmm,
Doesn't he send her? He sends her back out and tells her to like keep pretending or something.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, and oh, I forgot about Mr. Mason, the visitor. What was his deal? Please remind me. Um,
So, well, we kind of don't know his deal at first, and then he comes back. So Mr. Mason shows up. He's really mysterious, and Mr. Rochester's being super cagey about it. And we don't know what's going on. And then suddenly, in the middle of the night, Mr. Mason is attacked somehow, and then he's like bleeding out on the floor. And Jane is like, "This is weird." And Mr. Rochester's like, "You're gonna nurse him. You're gonna sit here with him and nurse him back to health while I go do something and be mysterious about it." And we kind of don't know what Mr. Mason's deal is. It's a mystery. It's part of the big mystery of Thornfield, until he comes back several chapters later, which we'll get to when we get to it.
yeah, but so Jane nurses him, and then I wrote in my copy, "So vampire," because there's a quote. There's a
Yeah,
quote where he says, "She has sucked the blood. She said she drained my heart." Um, so I was, of course, thinking about Twilight and
of course.
vampires. Yeah, he comes and then he goes pretty quickly, does he not?
Yes, he departs.
Hmm. He departs in secret, um, because Mr. Rochester urges him to. So he leaves before the rest of the party can kind of figure out that he has left, or
Mhm.
gets to see him off at the very least. Then we enter chapter 21, and towards the beginning of that chapter, we get a visit from Robert Levin, who announces, or not announces, but who informs Jane that Mrs. Reed has fallen ill, and is close to death, and that Jane should visit her now, if she wants to get the chance to before she passes away. So Jane seeks permission and receives permission, to go visit Mrs. Reed, and she returns. She returns Yeah, she returns to that house, which feels very different, or felt very different to me than her growing up there.
Yeah, and who are the sisters that we meet also at back at Gateshead?
Georgiana and Eliza, and they are, I think, much changed as well.
Mhm.
I believe Georgiana's the nicer of the two still, unless I
No.
have them mixed up.
Well, depending on how you look at it, Georgiana's like friendly and bubbly and really shallow. And we get the idea that she doesn't really care much about Mrs. Reed or Eliza.
Mhm.
But then Eliza is very practical, very pragmatic, kind of aloof. Um, I think Jane feels a greater kinship with Eliza, and Eliza ends up going to a convent and becoming a nun. So, but we get the idea the two sisters don't share great affection for one another.
Mhm.
I think
Which
Eliza,
I think Mrs. Reed
I
notes
wash
as
my
well.
to Georgiana. Oh, that's pretty embarrassing for them.
um, yeah, but um, yeah, so Jane, she returns to, kind of say goodbye to Mrs. Reed, and she ends up, Sarah, you noted that she kind of becomes Helen Burns, and that she forgives Mrs. Reed for, her wrongdoings, in the past, which I thought was very mature, and showed Jane's character development, because she was a very, very angry and, resentful as a child, I think. But now that she's kind of grown up and matured a bit, she has the capacity to forgive this woman,
Mm-hmm.
which I appreciated.
And it's really sad to watch too because we've got these very intense moments where Mrs. Reed is expressing a sort of not really not really regret for the past, but she does feel somewhat bad for the way that she's treated Jane, especially in her younger years. And there are these moments of, like, oh my gosh, like you didn't deserve that. I was being jealous and petty. But then we've also got, it seems like she's got some sort of dementia or Alzheimer's, and she doesn't quite always remember these moments. And so, then she'll go to sleep and wake up again and be like, oh my God, you're that demon child that made my life hell. Go away, get out of my house. And it's really painful to watch, but it is a beautiful thing to see Jane react with such grace and compassion and forgiveness. She really has become Helen Burns, in the beginning of the novel when she was at Lowood, she was like, Helen, how are you so kind to these people who mistreat you, who abuse you? You are just like, you're like a doormat. You let them walk all over you and you still say sorry and you still try to do your best. How do you do that? But now here we see she's with her former abuser who mistreated her as a child, sent her away, was just so cruel to her. And she's still saying, it's okay, I forgive you. And I'm going to be here with you while you die so that you're not alone. And I'm going to make sure that you've got someone here. And I think that's a really beautiful moment. It does, you're so right, Nadia. It does speak to Jane's strength of character. She is such an amazing, phenomenal, autonomous character. I love her so much. She's so secure in herself. She knows exactly who she is. She knows that she's not beholden to anyone's will but her own. And whenever she makes a decision, be it to, forgive Mrs. Reed or later to leave Thornfield, she is just completely convicted. She knows that's what she's going to do, even if it's hard. And she, I think, really values herself and values her own mind, her own values, her own decision making. And I think that's really beautiful to see. What else do we learn when Jane is visiting Mrs. Reed on her deathbed?
We learn as well that Jane has an uncle who attempted to get in touch with Jane. But Mrs. Reed kind of kept that from Jane until she's on her deathbed. So it's especially brave of Jane, I think, to forgive Miss Reed after this, because I'd be very upset if 3 years after the fact I was allowed to receive this letter from my uncle who was looking to get in touch with me. Um, yeah, and he wishes to adopt her during his life and bequeath her at his death whatever he may have to leave. So this is good news for Jane to hear, I think, at this point in her life.
It's good news,
But
yeah.
that's
It's
yeah, it's usually good news.
pressing, like, babe, you like this could have saved me like 3 years ago, bestie. I never had to go to Thornfield. I never had to get involved with this madman. So, bittersweet. It's bittersweet.
Yeah, but that's kind of the last big reveal that we get before Jane returns to Thornfield, where she's just falling more and more in love with Mr. Rochester. And she keeps falling more and more in love with him until he eventually uh, asks. Well, she confesses her love first, I believe. Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think he like goads her into confessing it because he's a little weirdo.
He's such a creep.
He's such a little
Um,
creep. I'm so glad that I have converted you into team Rochester is a creep. He is.
yeah, I get it a little bit now. He basically, because Jane is saying I'm gonna have to leave because you're gonna marry Miss Ingram. And Mr. Rochester is like, what are you talking about? I have no bride. And she's like, yes, you do, and I cannot stick around and watch you love her. Um, uh, so this is kind of a little bit of a blow up. I think we get a kind of a long speech in this chapter,
And
or a
really,
long passage of speech from Jane.
it's really sad for Jane too because this whole time, especially in those first 9 chapters that we talked about, Jane has got this really like crushing intrinsic need for home, to find a place that feels like home. And she doesn't get that at Gateshead. She doesn't get that at Lowood. And here, as she's returning to Thornfield, she is returning late. So I think Mr. Rochester had only wanted her to be gone a week, and she's returned a month later. But she says, how people feel when they are returning home from an absence long or short, I did not know. I had never experienced the sensation. I had known what it was to come back to Gateshead when a child, after a long walk, to be scolded for looking cold or gloomy, and later what it was to come back from church to Lowood, to long for a plenteous meal and a good fire, and to be unable to get either. Neither of these returnings was very pleasant or desirable. No magnet drew me to a given point, increasing in its strength of attraction the nearer I came. The return to Thornfield was yet to be tried. So this is on her way back. And then when she finally gets there, she realizes, she says, thank you, Mr. Rochester, for your great kindness. I'm strangely glad to get back to you again. And wherever you are is my home, my only home. So kind of that cliche trope, realizing home isn't a place, it's a person. But in this case, it's a little creep of a man.
A little creepy, yeah.
For Jane. So she, upon returning to Thornfield, she's got this realization that, oh, Thornfield is where I belong with Adele, with Mr. Rochester. But then she's willing to give that up because she sees that according to these social conventions, Blanche and Mr. Rochester, they have a thing. They are as good as engaged, if not actually engaged. And she realizes that, you know, her Christian values, her upstanding sense of morality demands that she leave and not be a part, not be so continually exposed to the temptation she would face being around him when he's married to another woman, which is foreshadowing for other things that happen.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, so chapter 23 comes, and Mr. Rochester and Jane are having a very intense conversation where she's saying this, that basically, I can't stay here and watch you love Miss Ingram and feel this temptation and become nothing to you. I won't stay here and let that happen. And then he decides to right now propose to her, which she takes offense to, doesn't she? Or she's a yeah, she takes offense. She says, I was silent. I thought he mocked me. Because she's saying, I can't watch you love this other woman. And he's like, I'm proposing to you right now. So he proposes to her. Jane is very confused and doesn't understand
And this is
why, like what is happening.
and this is where we get the iconic line, I am no bird and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will, which I now exert to leave you. And I love that quote so much. Like, I'm just going to start putting that in my everyday conversation. I have a free, independent will, which I now exert to leave you. That is the most iconic way to end a conversation ever. And I'm obsessed with it.
Yeah, I was reading this, and when I got to that one, I felt a little thrill. I was like, ooh.
Yes, it's like just sends a little shiver down your spine. It's so good. She's such a strong character. But I also think like this conversation is still so infused with Charlotte Bronte's sense of humor. It's really funny too. Like we've got this great banter back and forth between Jane and Rochester, and I love that Jane can just hold her own. My favorite part is it's so funny. It's she's just like he's still trying to convince her like, no, I don't love Miss Ingram. Like you're the woman for me. You're it for me. You're my bride. I'm gonna marry you. And she says, well, he says, come Jane, come hither. And she says, your bride stands between us, which is so funny. And he says, my bride is here because my equal is here and my likeness. Jane, will you marry me? And she says, still I did not answer, and still I writhed myself from his grasp, for I was still incredulous. Do you doubt me, Jane? Entirely. You have no faith in me. Not a whit. And she's so real for that. She's like, no, I don't trust this man. He's a liar. And I'm not afraid to call it as is. And I so admire her for that. And yes, of course, on the next page, she's like, okay, fine, I'll marry you, like, if you insist. Which, I mean, whatever, girl, you do you. But I think that's so, it's so strong, for one thing, to continually refuse this man who's pledging his undying love and devotion to you because you've got like that strong moral fiber. But it's also just so funny the way she's like, no, I do doubt you. You're completely untrustworthy. You literally dressed up as a fortune teller to get me to share my secrets, and my book fell apart.
Oh my gosh, oh no.
It's fine. That's what tape is for. If anybody feels like mailing me a new copy of Jane Eyre, that would be nice.
If anybody's willing to donate to support buying Sarah a new edition of Jane Eyre, greatly appreciated.
That is so sad. Anyway,
Was it just like down the middle?
no, it was like just the back flap.
Oh, that's so tragic.
Anyway, um,
This book is literally falling apart.
It's okay. That's what tape is for. It'll be fine. Yes, please donate to the Buy Sarah a New Copy of Jane Eyre Fund. Please.
Link in the description.
Oh gosh. Anyway, back to what I was saying. I just think that it's so lovely that Charlotte Bronte is infusing this humor into these very serious conversations. Because, she could have chosen to make this just a straight up drama and made the whole conversation very intense and very passionate. But she was like, no, I'm going to make it a little bit funny. We're going to undercut this tension with some comedic relief. And I think that's also very Austenian. We definitely see that coming through in some of the more serious moments in Pride and Prejudice and in Emma and all of the works in Northanger Abbey, all of these works that we love so much. Charlotte Bronte may not have had the best things to say about Jane Austen, but I feel like we've definitely got quite a bit of that technique bleeding through in Jane Eyre.
I'm still just laughing. You have no faith in me? Not a whit. Absolutely not.
That's hilarious. And she's so
Yeah,
real. I also have no
really
faith.
is a funny note. I also have no faith. Yeah, but we get this proposal, and then Jane, after a decent amount of resistance, eventually accepts the proposal. And then later couple of crazy stuff happen. Yeah, so they're well, before they start getting into all the details of the wedding and blah blah blah, Jane receives a warning from Mrs. Fairfax, who caught her and not caught, but caught a glimpse of Jane and Mr. Rochester having their little moment. So she gives Jane a warning. Sarah, I think you have a quote for that.
Yes. She asks, is it really for love he is going to marry you? Which is really ominous. Like, why would you say that to somebody? Um, and Jane, she's really hurt by her coldness, her skepticism. She's crying. And Mrs. Fairfax says, I'm sorry to grieve you, but you are so young and so little acquainted with men. I wish to put you on your guard. It is an old saying that all is not gold that glitters. And in this case, I do fear there will be something found to be different to what either you or I expect. And Jane says, why? Am I a monster? Is it impossible that Mr. Rochester should have a sincere affection for me? And she says, no, it's nothing about you. It's just that this man is a little weirdo and I'm a little worried about you. And we find out later that, there are strange things afoot in Thornfield in the Rochester house. And Miss Fairfax might not know the specifics, but she's got an inkling that something's wrong. And I think it was really good of her to try and warn Jane, like, hey, something feels wrong. This is women supporting women. Look, I know you're young. I know you're barely, I think she's still a teenager at this point. I think she's still like 18 or 19 at this.
Yeah.
And she says, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but like, really think about this guy. Why is this guy who is twice your age and ugly?
Yeah, she says he might almost be your father, is a direct quote from Mrs.
Yes,
Fairfax.
which is true. Um, she's saying like, hey, something smells fishy to me. Just keep an eye out, keep your ear open. And of course Jane doesn't take that too well, but then we find out later that she really should have.
Yeah, so we get this warning. It doesn't prove to do much. And the wedding planning proceeds. It happens, or it is intended at least to happen on what I thought was a very quick timeline. It seems they kind of have this little engagement, and then Mr. Rochester's, we have to get married right now.
Yes, I
We gotta
believe
go to
it's
London and get married.
supposed to be a month, which
Which
is
I don't know
common for,
how long things took
but
back
still.
then, but say that again.
Oh, I just said, I think their engagement period was supposed to be a month, which isn't too uncommon for that era, but it certainly felt very rushed the way that
Mhm.
Mr. Rochester was pushing it. And Jane is,
I think especially because we only get like one chapter of like engagement.
and Jane is very uncomfortable throughout the engagement because he
Mhm.
keeps trying to shower her with all of these lavish presents, these expensive jewels and a beautiful veil. And Jane is like, no, like, this is not who I am. I'm your plain Quakerish child bride, which is like so weird. Like, why would you? That's, um, and but he's getting her these lavish dresses, all of these fine things. And then what happens to the veil? The fancy, beautiful, exotic veil that he gets her.
The veil isn't it trampled by a mysterious figure
It's ripped
who
in half.
we it's ripped in half. Okay, well, it's a bit more than trampled then.
Yes.
um, but it is the veil is assaulted by a mysterious figure who enters Jane's room while she is asleep, or kind of asleep at least in those sleepiness states. But this figure enters her room and starts to basically destroy her wedding gear.
And Jane
And we
Rochester later when she has a chance to see him. And she's like, oh my gosh, there was this creepy, crazy goblin lady in my room. I was so scared. And, you know, like I would have thought it was a dream, but then I woke up and
Mhm.
the wedding veil was completely ruined on the floor. I don't know what's going on. That's crazy. And then he like completely gaslights her about it. He says, he says, oh, well, like, did you see her face? Like, did you really? And she says, well, no, but I saw sort of the reflection in the glass. And she describes it, and he's like, I don't know. I think you're making this up. I think you were actually just asleep. And he says that the woman she saw was the creature of an overstimulated brain, that is certain. I must be careful of you, my treasure. Nerves like yours were not made for rough handling. Shut up, my man. Be quiet. You are just gaslighting her at this point. He's saying, no, you're crazy. You made it up. I think he tells her it was just Grace Poole. You know, she's a little weirdo. She's the little freak that we keep in the attic. And you were asleep and you were scared. So your brain just kind of superimposed this scary goblin image onto her while she was ripping up your wedding veil. And that's totally normal and cool and fine. He's just straight up gaslighting her. And I hate it here. I don't like this man. I simply would not fall in love with him.
Yeah, he's proving to be quite manipulative, which I think is interesting because I feel like when we first met him, he was not, or I at least did not perceive him as this manipulative, but he seems now that he knows or that he feels, I guess, that he's secured Jane in a way. He can do whatever he wants. And he's scheming and lying and keeping things from her. He says in this same chapter, um, I see you would ask why I keep such a woman in my house, referring to Grace Poole. Um, when we have been married a year and a day, I will tell you, but not now. Why
Isn't
not?
that
Tell
because
me now.
isn't that okay? I could be wrong. I could be messing up my history there, but I think that's because you can only get a marriage annulled within a year back then.
Can you really?
Yeah, because like
Or could you really? I guess.
is an annulment is like saying the marriage was never valid in the first place. It's not like a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, they cheated on me. They, like something happened to nullify the whole marriage like from the get-go, so it was never valid. And I think that was only like within the first year. that you could have that annulment. After then, it would have had to have been like a divorce, and then that was like illegal. And if it did happen, you couldn't get remarried. So I think that that's why he said a year and a day, because then she wouldn't be able to get an annulment because he was cheating on her. Well, I mean, he was technically cheating on Bertha with her. Anyway, that was a spoiler. Let's continue.
Yeah, speaking speaking of, um, so the wedding proceedings and the marriage proceedings continue until it comes to the wedding day, and it is time for the wedding, and the priest is doing his thing. He's giving his little marriage speech. Well, not marriage speech. He's orchestrating the wedding, and he invites any objections, and we get an objection from um from this is we get a from Mr. Briggs, I believe is the name. We get an objection, and this objection basically says that man cannot get married. He is already married to a woman that he keeps locked in his house, which is a crazy thing to say. But it turned out to be totally true, which is, I think, what officially took me off the Mr. Rochester support train, because this is a wild revelation.
Mm-hmm. And then Mr. Rochester kind of just goes crazy and brings everybody into his attic to exhibit his mad wife like an animal in a zoo. Then she attacks him, and he's like, "Can you blame me? Can you really blame me for wanting something else?" And I'm like, "My man, I cannot take you seriously."
Yeah.
I don't know. I have my own private opinions about Bertha Mason and how Mr. Rochester was like, "Oh, she's going to turn crazy, so I'm going to lock her up," and that's what actually turned her crazy. Um, but that's a soapbox for another day. We're not
It's
talking
like a yellow wallpaper kind of scenario, but
um
if
but
you
like,
lock a woman up for years, she is gonna go a little mad.
yeah,
Anyone would.
absolutely crazy way to treat your wife. Even if like, you didn't want the marriage, even if it's not an ideal situation,
Mm-hmm.
what a crazy way to treat your wife.
Yeah.
But then so how does Jane respond to all of this?
Jane, while all this is happening, I thought she's notably very quiet, and Mr. Rochester kind of notes this too when they're staring at this mad woman Bertha. And he says, I wanted Jane because she's so calm and she's tranquil, and look at her, this young girl who stands so grave and quiet at the mouth of hell, looking collectively at the gambols of a demon. So Jane was very calm while all this was unfolding. But then afterwards, when she and Mr. Rochester are having a conversation, she basically says, I have to go. I cannot stay with you. I have to leave. Let me leave. I am leaving. And she's very firm about this. He tries over and over to attempt to kind of convince her to stay, to stick around. But she's insistent, and she's very firm in saying that she will leave. Mr. Rochester, I must leave you.
And yes, I love this part so much. I think once again, we keep talking about Jane's strength of character, her own conviction and her morals and her values. And I think it is so clear here and so strong here. She's got kind of this little crisis going on. Let's see. I think in maybe the beginning, yes, in the beginning of chapter 25, she's talking about she doesn't know herself. Who will I be once I'm married? Um, so should I, or rather not I, but one Jane Rochester, a person whom as yet I knew not. Mrs. Rochester, she did not exist. She would not be born till tomorrow, sometime after 8 o'clock a.m. And I would have and I would wait to be assured that she'd come into the world alive before I had assigned to her all that property, talking about all of the things, the lavish gifts Mr. Rochester was bestowing upon her. She says, like, I don't know who Mrs. Rochester would be. I only know who Jane Eyre is. And then that kind of comes full circle again in this last chapter, 27, when she's talking about, she says, like, Mrs. Rochester, that was never going to be me. Mrs. Rochester, the idea of that fantasy that I had, she's dead. I'm Jane Eyre again. Um, and she says, oh gosh, this part just it hurts my heart because she's got these voices in her head saying, oh, comply, think of his misery. This is Mr. Rochester. Think of his danger. Look at his state when left alone. Remember his headlong nature. Consider the recklessness following on despair. Soothe him, save him, love him, tell him you love him and will be his. Who in the world cares for you, or who will be injured by what you do? She's going through this really strong crisis, but still she says, still indomitable was the reply, I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man. I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad as I am now. So we've got this kind of moment where she's like, we've got this fun little parallel between Jane and Bertha.
Mhm.
That makes me really happy, and that maybe we can explore a little bit more in coming episodes. But she is just so, she knows herself. She knows who she is. She knows what she stands for. And, she has known all along that, like, Mr. Rochester, this wealthy socialite, young child bride that she was supposed to become upon her marriage to Mr. Rochester, that was never going to be her. And she was resisting that actively by resisting all of these lavish gifts, making sure her wedding dress was, as plain as possible. And then I think, too, that moment we see right after the discovery has been made of Bertha and they've visited her in the attic, the moment when Jane takes off her wedding dress, sheds it, and puts back on the stuff dress that she never thought she'd have to wear again. She kind of makes her peace with it, saying, like, this is who I am. This is who I've always been. This is who I've always be. I can't pretend to be somebody else. And it's very symbolic. And I think it's very beautiful that she's still holding true to her values. Even, she does love this man. We may not like him, but Jane does. She likes him. She loves him. She calls him master and, wants to be with him. She wants to love him. She wants to take care of him. But she knows in her heart that she would never feel right about it. She would be, in her mind, committing a sin because he's married. And you can't go after a married man. That's illegal. That's not cool. She has to respect the vows that he made before God with Bertha, even if he doesn't respect them. And that just makes her such a strong, admirable character that I love so much.
Yeah, I just love how firm and confident and strong she is in her morals and her morality and kind of her beliefs and values in life. She refuses, like, oh, she repeatedly refuses to compromise those values, even though he's begging her. He seems to threaten her at one point. He says, Jane, will you hear reason? Because if you won't, I'll try violence. And despite all of this, he's so scary, but she's firm in her resistance and she's strong in her beliefs and her values and her commitment to kind of being good. And I love that about her. Like, even in the face of all of this man who she's fallen hopelessly in love with, and he still wants her. He wants her so badly, but she knows that it would be wrong to do it like this, and her resistance, anyways, is just so admirable.
I think she's actually a lot like, surprisingly, Fanny Price in that way. So, so morally upright, very dedicated to her principles. I think they maybe express it in very different ways. And it's interesting because I think the two characters have been received in very different ways over the years, but they've still got this very strong moral compass, this North Star that guides them in all they do, and they refuse to compromise that in any way, which I think is really interesting to see. All right, folks, I think that's all we have for you today, but we would love to hear your thoughts on what are probably the juiciest chapters of Jane Eyre. Lots of things happened. There were some revelations, there were some plot twists. So if you would like to add anything to the conversation, please leave us a comment, send us an email, just reach out. We would love to hear from you. Otherwise, please join us on July 8th when we recap chapters 28 through 33. We would love to have you there to continue our journey throughout the lovely story that is my falling apart copy of Jane Eyre.
Fallen. At this point. But yeah, we hope you will join us next week for the next installment of our vlog series. And until then, we humbly request one more time that you please consider donating at the link in the description and also on the screen here. That you consider donating to support our programming. I'm hang on, one more time. And last but not least, we humbly request that you please consider donating at the link in the description and on the screen. We so appreciate your support of our programming, and it really means a lot to us here at Jane Austen Summer Program and Jane Austen & Co.
All right. Once again, thank you so much. I've been Sarah.
And I've been Nadea.
Until next time, happy reading.
And happy viewing. Happy do both. Do it all.